I had started recording this video earlier, but I was taking way too long to get through what was happening. I was spending too much time on things that don't matter. So the first video I uploaded on my channel originally was a review of Into the Mist by PC Cast. It was one of those videos where I would like read a bit and then ramble about my thoughts and then read a bit and then ramble about my thoughts. And it was a really long video, and it was also not very well done because I had never talked about a book like that before, and I also hadn't edited a video in a really long time, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I want to redo that video. I want to still share my thoughts on this book and this duology, but I want to try and do it in a slightly more cohesive way. So let's try that again. Also, apologies for my hair and if the lighting changes, because it's like 5:30 p.m., so the sun is going down. So, some background. Into the Mist is a contemporary dystopian in the words of the author. It is a feminist dystopian about wine, women, and weed. It follows an event where there's a bunch of explosions and these bombs release this green mist that is a like gendercidal biological weapon, essentially. We're following this group of high school teachers as they navigate the end of their world, essentially. A point that is worth noting, PC Cast is a retired high school English teacher, and the character of Mercury, who is like kind of our main narrator, particularly for the first book, she is, in PC Cast's own words, based on PC Cast when she was a young teacher. So just bear that in mind for certain things through this book. I should note I have not reread this book. I took a lot of notes when I was reading it. So I'm going off of the notes I took and like trying to re-summarize the book. We open with Mercury and her best friend Stella talking while they're at the Timberline Lodge. We don't find out that they are at the Timberline Lodge until like a full page into their conversation, pretty much. They are just gossiping in a void. We have no idea where they are or what's going on. But they're talking about like sleeping with younger men and the weather and tipping etiquette and just a bunch of random stuff that really doesn't matter and doesn't particularly tell us anything about them or their world. They are eventually interrupted by the principal of their school. They're at some kind of like teaching conference, and the principal of their school, Mr. Hale, is like kind of rushing them and being like, you gotta get in the van, like we gotta get to the airport, let's go. And very much presented like we shouldn't like him, notably in how he's described. He's described in unflattering terms, like his thinning hair and stuff like that. And like we're supposed to not like him, but I'm like, no, that seems pretty fair. Like if I was in charge of this big work trip with all the teachers, and you have to make sure everyone is on schedule and everyone gets to the airport on time and like everyone's traveling together, like, yeah, I would probably be a bit frazzled and maybe a bit pushy trying to make sure that people actually get where they're supposed to go. That seems pretty fair to me. But no, we're supposed to think he's awful. We meet a few other characters in this scene. Notably, we meet Jenny, who's like a younger teacher. We meet Karen, who is like, I think she's the oldest of the group, and she's supposed to be this stereotypical like uptight bigoted Christian woman. But like, and this is a thing I'm going to bring up throughout, the characters will tell us things about Karen that make her out to be very bad. Like, Karen is homophobic and all this stuff. But what we are shown of Karen does not support those claims. And mostly she just comes across as like just this poor woman that they bully all the time for being kind of uptight and occasionally a bit annoying. Justice for Karen. We also meet Imani, who is the token black character of the group, and we are told that immediately. She's given a very detailed description compared to the other characters. And of course, she's the only character whose skin color is emphasized in her description. Anyway, eventually they finally do get into their van. They're also with the like school coach or gym teacher or something, and a pregnant woman who is, I believe, is another teacher at the school. They finally get on the road and they're driving. The next chapter, so that was chapter 1, the next chapter, they're driving for a bit and they end up stopping at this like overlook, like scenic spot. I think because a character needs to go pee. I distinctly remember there being a joke about pee, so I'm pretty sure that's what it's about. They're like enjoying the view. Karen makes a comment about how beautiful God's creation is. Mercury in her narration gets really mad at her for shoving religion down people's throats. I do want to put a pin in that, the whole shoving religion down people's grout comment. I also want to put a pin in the claim that Karen is homophobic. We'll get to both those points later. But they're at this overlook. There's some gossiping and selfies and, not very important things going on. And then finally, right before the end of the chapter, the plot shows up. And the plot shows up in the form of the explosions I mentioned earlier. There's first there's this like sound wave, which is like an EMP blast that makes... In the text, it's any electronic that was on when the EMP blast went off will no longer work. It's inert now. I don't know if that's true to how an EMP would actually work, but sure. And then there's another explosion that sends out this green mist. The writing here is not strong. PCcast has an issue with repetition of words. The word green is used so many times in the span of 2 pages, as well as synonyms for green, like emerald and jade. And there's also an issue with just using way too many words. Something that appeared to be, which if say the sentence is something that appeared to be a bomb, you don't need to use that many words. You could just say it looked like a bomb or it seemed to be a bomb. And that like something that appeared to be is too many words. Something tells me you're unclear what it is. Appeared to be tells me that you're unsure what it is. You don't need both of those. And there's also an ongoing issue with tone in her descriptions. Like she will compare really gruesome things to things that are just kind of silly, or describe things in ways that just like that's not what those words mean. We'll see that in the next chapter. First I'll go over the descriptions that aren't good, and then I'll get into what actually happens in that chapter. So like in describing a body that had like disintegrated and dissolved, the phrasing is like he had been held together by a string of wet dominoes. Not only is that kind of like a string of wet dominoes is just kind of a silly sounding description, like it doesn't convey the sinister and horrified tone that this is supposed to have. This is supposed to be really gruesome, but also wet dominoes. Dominoes are usually wood or plastic, so if they're wet, they're just kind of slippery. Like they don't dissolve when they're wet. They're not made of paper. So like it's a weird description. There's also like a macabre jello mold left out in the summer heat. Like that doesn't have the right tone. Comparing something to jello, and it just doesn't work for what this scene is supposed to be. But getting into what the chapter actually is, the characters have all passed out after this like wave of mist goes over them, and Mercury wakes up and she sees the 2 men with them like dissolve and into goo, and they're both dead. Obviously they're goo. And then the pregnant woman they were with is in distress, and she miscarries. And then after she miscarries, she dies. And the reason she miscarries is because the baby she was carrying would have been assigned male at birth. So she's carrying a, I don't like the term, but quote unquote biologically male child. So this is important because the only reason that baby would die is if the green mist specifically targets biology. Because a baby, especially an unborn baby, does not have a concept of self, let alone a concept of gender. So the mist cannot be targeting gender. It has to be targeting some sort of biological marker of sex. This is a moment where Karen is being very like shit on and treated poorly because, a bunch of bombs just went off. There's dead bodies everywhere. She watched a woman miscarry and die. Her friends are covered in blood. She has no idea what's happening. It seems like the world is ending. And she, of course, is hysterical. That's very fair. But Mercury responds by grabbing her and shaking her and yelling at her to get it together. And it's like, hey, what the fuck? Like, this is a perfectly reasonable human response to be having to this situation, but it's presented like Karen is dumb or annoying. And it's just like, this book is so unfair to Karen.
They finally destroyed the world. Stella spoke with no emotion, but she wrapped her arms around her torso while tears dripped from her eyes down her cheeks to soak the long-sleeved shirt she'd layered under her sweater. Mercury could only manage one word. They? Men, politicians, them. The greedy, corrupt people in charge whose job it was to keep us safe. Stella's voice cut like a knife.
There's also more shitting on Karen because she wants to provide a proper Christian burial, particularly for the mother and the baby that miscarried. It's important to bear in mind that like in her beliefs, there's probably some kind of like existential consequence for a body not properly being buried and prayed over, like in terms of what their afterlife is, in terms of if they can get into heaven, like that kind of stuff. And so like, yes, it's fair to pull her away from that and be like, we don't have time, like we need to go, because there's like the cliff they're on is unstable and they don't know if there's going to be more explosions, and like there's safety concerns following what has just happened. But there's a way to do it that is like empathetic and understanding, and these characters are just so mean to her about it, and again treating her like she's an idiot or annoying for wanting to like basically wanting to grieve and give proper burial to these tragic victims of a wildly unforeseen circumstance. Sorry, I had to turn the light on, so my lighting is different now. Anyway, so then the like ground starts shaking, there's some earthquakes happening. There's a car nearby that still works. I can't remember if it's because it wasn't turned on when the explosion went off, or if it's because it's an older car that doesn't have as much like electronic stuff in it. But in any case, they get in a car and they're driving off away from where the cliffside was collapsing. So they're driving in this truck that they commandeered. I believe it's Mercury is taking stock of like what's in the truck, what do they have access to. She finds a loaded gun in the glove box, and all she really has to say about it is just like, oh yeah, Okies and Texans, we love our guns. And I'm like, well, one, they're not in Oklahoma, they're in West Timberline Ridge, Oregon, whatever. Not particularly concerned about there being a loaded gun in the glove box. She also finds jelly beans, which are described as oblong balls of color, which is just ridiculous description. There's some more shitting on Karen for, practical things like being concerned about there being a loaded gun in the glove box while they're careening down the highway. They have really, really stilted dialogue about like, as you know, I'm proficient in firearms, and there's gonna be like, I'm excellent with a gun, but I'm also for sensible gun laws, and just like things no one would say in a casual conversation. Like, this is first draft dialogue for you to get the ideas down, and then you make them sound like people. But the make them sound like people step didn't happen, unfortunately. The shitting on Karen continues with Mercury fat shaming her. I wrote down, the quote is, 30 or so pounds too heavy and probably hadn't really sweated since her 20s. So, this is meant to shame Karen, but it just makes me hate Mercury. And again, bear in mind, Mercury is the self-insert for PC Cast. They come upon a bunch of like stalled vehicles, and there's some people around, and everyone is kind of concerned and wants to help them, but Karen is like, I thought we needed to hurry, like maybe we shouldn't stop and help them. And everyone shits on Karen. The chapter ends, we open the next chapter, Karen is going like, okay, so we'll help them, and now everyone's being like, no, maybe we won't actually. We'll just talk with the window rolled down, and I'm like, one, this needed more editing. Two, just leave Karen alone. So they do pull over, they do talk to these people who are hurt on the roadside. One of them is a young girl named Gemma. She's doing some first aid work because she's done like some kind of, I can't remember what it was, but I remember she wants to be a doctor, and I believe at this point in the story she had done some volunteer work relating to like first aid or a hospital or something. And so like we paused to like praise her for how great she is, but the characters are doing this while there's people like bleeding out on the roadside, but they're like stopping their work to praise her, and it's just like the optics are crazy of like, guys, priorities. There's also a moment where like a character is swearing and Karen tells them to watch their language, and Stella is like basically tells Karen that she will abandon her on the roadside in the middle of the apocalypse if she criticizes someone's language again. And it's like, guys, like, people are allowed to be a little annoying. That doesn't mean you abandon them to death. We also meet the kind of main antagonist for this book, or one of the main antagonists for this book, who is a man named Al. And I forgot about this, but I noted it in my notes. When describing Al, a villainous cishet man, Mercury thinks the blood in his teeth looks like poorly applied lipstick. Queer coding your villains. I forgot about that. Anyway, that's the end of the chapter. The next chapter, what am I up to? Chapter 6? So Al is being kind of pushy about wanting in their truck. He wants to, I can't remember if he just wants to join them in their truck or if he wants to take their truck, but they're like, oh no, I remember, he wants to get in the bed of their truck. And they're like, no, we have supplies there and we're not getting rid of any of our supplies. Like because they have all their bags with them. He's being pushy about it, and I can't remember if it's Mercury or Stella, but they threaten to shoot him. And it's like, hey, you're in a truck. Like, you could just drive away. I think they do put a few of the most injured people in the bed of the truck, but like Al isn't that injured, so they're like, you're fine, you don't need to get in the truck. But anyway, I just thought that was a bit extreme, to threaten to shoot him when, like, you can just drive. You are in a vehicle, he is not. This is also where we get the beginning of characters making decisions based on feelings, a PC Cast classic, and this will plague the rest of the duology, where there's no motivation or logic behind the things characters do. They do it because a feeling told them to, aka the author railroaded the plot in that direction. The next chapter is just kind of like travel and talking and recapping what happened, which is really annoying as a reader. Especially in situations where, like, I think this is around when they meet back up with Imani, and so they're like trying to fill Imani in on what happened, because she was in like a different van or something, like she wasn't in their vehicle, so now they've met back up, and she is asking like what happened, but Mercury already said 2 separate times that it was a bomb, but then has to explain again that it's a bomb. But like the text it doesn't seem aware of this repetition. So again, this is like an editing issue of like, you need to go back in and tighten up your narration and dialogue, because like we already know, we've had this conversation. I, as a reader, don't want to retread this. That's not interesting. Everyone's kind of freaking out because they're assuming, like, based on the scale of the bombing in their area, they're assuming other areas of the states have been hit, and they're just kind of assuming that anywhere with a major military base was hit, which, like, I don't really know how they came to that conclusion. Imani in particular is really upset because she is assuming her husband and kids are dead, and like Stella and Mercury are crying with her. But it's just interesting because I don't think that same courtesy is consistently extended to other characters. They eventually make it to they go back to the Timberline Lodge because it's like kind of the closest place they know and can like retrace their steps to. It has become kind of like a sanctuary for survivors. There's a lot of people grouped up there, injured people being tended to, and we spend a few chapters here. Notably, in this scene, they meet a woman named Dr. Hillary, she's called Dr. Hillary, but she's not like an MD. She's like, I think she's a homeopathic person, but is like treated as if she's, I have thoughts. So she's like doing a lot of work tending to the injured. Mercury and Stella there's like a little gift shop area in the lodge that like sells a lot of basic necessities and stuff. So I believe it's either Mercury and Stella or Mercury and Imani. I can't remember. I think it's Mercury and Imani. And they go to this store to like gather stuff up. There's an interesting line where the little like gift shop or boutique or whatever is described as rustic chic, and then among the items that are listed that it sells includes dream catchers, which is an interesting choice on the part of the author. Mostly this chapter is just people talking and completing very simple tasks, and it's a pretty boring chapter that probably should have been cut or at least cut down. The next chapter, Imani and Mercury bring the supplies back to Doc Hillary. Doc Hillary asks them if they have any medical training. They say they're both science teachers, and she says, good enough. I don't know what the logic there is. We get several paragraphs where she's explaining how to administer medication, which like conceptually isn't the worst, but this book already has so much padding that I feel like we could have summed that up. Also, I will have some thoughts about that later in terms of the kinds of care that Doc Hillary provides. They talk about, again, recap things that happened and what the mist does and blah, blah, blah. And Gemma hypothesizes that the mist must target men based on who they've seen die and how quickly they died. So again, we're coming back to the premise of this book is that this is a biological weapon that targets men So remember that as we go forward in this series. This is kind of another nothing chapter. It's just people talking, recapping things, and then there's like this very minor side character named Bob who dies, and we're supposed to be really sad about it. But we didn't really know him. The next chapter has like an entire page of just talking about booze, because this is a book about wine, women, and weeds, so we spend a lot of time talking about alcohol. This chapter involves several of the women working together in the kitchen. I think it's Stella and Mercury and Imani, and they're like working together to prepare a meal. It's mostly just them kind of talking about their lives, which conceptually is fine. This is a good moment. Like, we just had a bunch of, well, save for the last two. It would be a good moment if it weren't for the last two chapters. It's a good idea to have all this adrenaline and like high stakes action happen, and then we slow down and have a moment where the characters just like talk about their lives before, and you know, get to know certain things about each other. Notably, they were talking about like exes and divorce, and like who had plans to have kids but didn't have them, and this sort of thing. And during this conversation, Mercury talks about, I think it's Mercury, talks about an ex she had and how he had a kid and like he wanted to have kids with her, but he was like kind of shitty to the kid he did have. And the phrasing that's used is he wanted a normal kid, and Imani responds to that with, oh, so he had a disabled kid, which is a very yikes thing to say, but also the way the book the way Mercury responds to that, or maybe it's Stella, again, I can't remember if it was Mercury or Stella, but the way whoever responds to that is just to be like, no, he had a normal kid, except he treated the kid poorly, so the kid, like, you know, had behavioral and attitude issues and stuff. But like, no one in this scene ever addresses the idea that like the concept of having a disabled kid and resenting it and wanting a normal child. No one addresses that at all. And so there's just this very casual, totally unnecessary ableism in this scene that goes completely unaddressed, which tells me that probably no one working on this book realized the implications of those statements. Mid-chapter location change. I know, I don't love it either, but my phone battery was dying, so I needed to move to a place where I could plug in my phone. So they spend this chapter mostly talking about like, or at least a good chunk of this chapter talking about like exes and beliefs on marriage and kids and stuff like that. What's notable is they're preparing food, and I think someone accidentally cuts themselves and they bleed on the potatoes. And the potato, then soon after, they notice it's sprouting. And there's this whole big discussion about how that potato definitely wasn't sprouting before. And so they then, I think each of them go around and they cut their hands to check if they make the potatoes grow or something. I know that does happen at some point. And some of them, their blood makes plants grow, and some of them, their blood doesn't make plants grow. I can't remember exactly who that is. I'm pretty sure maybe Imani one of the ones whose blood doesn't make plants grow. It doesn't super matter. The point is that generally women who have been changed by the mist, a lot of them, their blood has a magical effect that makes plants grow. That's essentially what's established in this chapter in terms of like plot relevant information. The next chapter, they've been tending to more wounded people. One of them happened to have a giant stash of edibles with them, so everyone gets super high. And this is a point where I want to start talking about Dr. Hillary, because this is where I found where it, like in my notes where it says what she is. She's a naturopath. When there was that whole big scene earlier where she went on for several paragraphs explaining how to administer medication, she at no point said that they should check with their patients if they already have a medication that they take, or if they have had any kind of drugs or alcohol within a certain period of time. Given that this is a lodge that we know serves alcohol because Stella had alcohol on the steps of the lodge from in the lodge, that seems like it would be an important question for the doctor to be asking, but it's just never brought up. And in this scene, there's no concern for anyone taking edibles when they are also on other medications like painkillers. So I thought that was a very interesting note in terms of how medical practice is presented in this book. There's a lot of recapping about the bombs. Again, there's so much recapping in this book, but again, that's a PC Cast classic. This is also the point where we learn that the lodge had 200 guests and 30-ish staff at the time of the bombs, and there's just about 40 survivors. A lot of people were killed in an earthquake that was triggered by the bomb, but it's worth noting that like this is the first time that we are seeing like a large group in a fixed location, and at no point in any of the conversation around the people hurt and the people who've died and the people who have survived, at no point is there any thought, mention, nod toward the idea or even the question of intersex, non-binary, and trans individuals and how the mist would affect them. It becomes more of an issue as we keep going forward, but this was the first moment where I, as a reader, started really being like, okay, is anyone going to acknowledge this? Because I'm going to go on a little tangent here. These characters are teachers. They teach at a high school. So some of them have been teaching for well over a decade, meaning they've taught probably like hundreds of kids. And presumably, you know, a group of high school teachers in the late 2010s into the 2020s, this book was written in 2020, through the 2010s into the 2020s, presumably at least one of these teachers at some point in their career would have had a trans or non-binary student. They probably had intersex students too, but they might not have known about that. And yet, like, none of them even have a thought of that. None of them have any friends or family members or neighbors or community members or coworkers, or like, there's no one in their life or awareness who is trans or non-binary. Like that's the only justification I can think of for why not a single one of these characters thinks of trans and non-binary people in this situation. And that becomes more egregious when Dr. Hillary is introduced, because, and this becomes a thing in the next book, we'll get to that, but Dr. Hillary is the first queer character we're introduced to in this series. Presumably, I mean, certainly there are, queer folks who are not exactly allies to other members of the queer community, but it's not a stretch to say maybe a lesbian should know that trans people exist, and so I think this is the point where it starts becoming really notable that is excluded from this book, and it becomes like more notable as we go forward and we keep having conversations about men versus women and like that kind of gender division, because ultimately this is a book about gender. But that's a bit of a digression. I mentioned Hillary being gay. Hillary talks about her dead wife because, of course, her queerness is introduced in the form of tragedy. Her wife died in the earthquake. Karen is present for that conversation. And Karen does not react to learning that Hillary is a lesbian. She just doesn't care. So Mercury making a big deal about calling Karen homophobic earlier rings false, because as far as I can tell, Karen doesn't care. The next chapter, they're hanging out in one of the rooms at the lodge drinking wine, and Karen is shit on. She says she doesn't drink, and like they just gang up on her and insist that she has to drink, and like, well, if you don't have a history of alcoholism, there's no reason for you not to drink. And like, it's just super shitty. But it's presented as like this freeing thing that they do for her, because they free her from the restrictive chains of her, Christianity, where she wasn't allowed to drink. But I'm like I, as a reader, fucking hated this scene because I don't drink alcohol. So when I read a scene where a bunch of characters gang up on someone for politely declining a drink of alcohol, it doesn't feel very good to me. And I have to imagine that that's the case for some other readers too. And regardless, it's just a shitty thing for anyone to do to anyone. Like, whether that person usually drinks but doesn't feel like it right now, or that person never drinks, or that person doesn't drink for medical reasons or because of past addiction, or whether that person doesn't drink for religious reasons. Like, regardless of why someone declines a drink, it's not your business, and it's just really shitty to treat them the way the characters treat Karen in this book. There's a bunch more of, I think this must be the scene, because I say there's an entire page of them describing cutting their fingers and bleeding onto potatoes. So this must be the scene where they fully test the blood and potatoes and plant growth thing. There's more talk about the mist killing men. Stella is again talking about how the world would be better if more men died.
I wonder what it's going to be like now. There'll be a lot fewer men, said Stella. Well, if that's true, I hope women do a better job of running things, said Karen. Stella snorted. It'd be damn difficult to do worse. We're going to do a better job, said Gemma firmly. Imani lifted her glass to the teenager. I like your conviction. Gemma shrugged. Yeah, well, anyone who's been in school knows girls are more mature than guys, and now some of us have superpowers.
We get some info dumping from notably Gemma about her family situation, which just exists to establish that she isn't close with her parents. So that, spoiler alert, when her parents are gone, we don't have to actually care, and she doesn't have to actually grieve, really, and we can just carry right along. Which is, it's not handled well in the scene, like the way she info dumps about her family. It really feels like an info dump, and it's not handled well when that separation happens. There's more talk about like Mercury has a moment where she's reflecting on all of the people she knows who are probably dead now based on their supposition of like what has happened with these bombs and what places were targeted. When she's thinking about all the people who've died, she just thinks about, how many is it? Her 12 best friends, who I will note, all of them are names of people that PCcast is associated with in the past. It's a lot of other authors and stuff.
Editing Rachel here. I have had a shower, so excuse my hair. Because I'm sure there will be people who are curious, here is the list of the 12 friends that Mercury notes. They are Teresa, Kim, Robin, Sean, Lola, Cher, Sharon, Kristen, Bridget, Gina, Jill, and Cressley. Now, of all of those names, there were a handful that I like. It's not all of them, but I think it's like at least half. Yeah, about half of them are names of authors that like I already knew PCcast was associated with, or like authors and creatives that I knew PCcast was associated with. So there's Teresa Miller, who is a writer and was PCcast's former creative writing teacher, and she has hosted PCcast on, I think it was called like Writing Out Loud or something. Kim Donor, who is an artist who has done several illustrations for PCcast books. She in fact may have done the illustrations for this duology. I don't recall. I'd have to look that up. There's Lola Palazzo, who is not an author, but she's like a cook or something. And she was business partners with Kristen Cast. Kristen Cast funded her food truck. I'm sorry for saying the name of this food truck, but I do have to say it. PCcast funded a food truck called Lola's Gypsy Caravan. So that's one of the names listed. The other one, Kristen, that's just Kristen Cast. It's PCcast's daughter. Then there's Gina Showalter, who is another author. She has co-authored works with PCcast and Kristen Cast separately. So like earlier this year when I read After Moonrise, Gina Showalter was the other author on that. And then Cresley Cole, who was another author, like working in the same kind of genre as PCcast. So I just thought that was interesting. I'm sure there would be people who would be curious about that information. So I figured I would throw it in there.
But there's no thought about like her parents, or like she's mentioned having brothers, but she doesn't think about them here. There's no thought about like if she has any, nieces or nephews or anything. None of them. No family. Just her friends. But ultimately, nothing happens in this chapter again. We didn't start. We arrived at a point early in the book of some, high stakes and drama and action and adrenaline. And then the last several chapters have just been an incredibly plodding pace. That is a overall sense of this book. It is a lot of fluff and plodding along and not a whole lot actually happening. So chapter 13. I forgot to mention earlier in the chapter where they were cooking and talking about exes and stuff, Imani had a moment where she's like, ugh, white people, because as the token black woman she has to do that. And now in this chapter, in chapter 13, Imani gets mad at, I think it's Gemma's mom, because Gemma's mom wants to leave and search for her husband. And like leaves her daughter behind, which like I would have preferred if it was presented with a bit more like nuance and complication, because like to me as a mom, I'm like, okay, if I had like I think Gemma's like 16, if I had a 16-year-old kid and it was the apocalypse and I'd found a safe place, like a sanctuary where I could leave my daughter and then I could go out onto the road to try and find out if my partner was alive or had perished, I could understand that being a complicated choice to make, because on the one hand, your kid is alive, you want to stay with your kid, but on the other hand, what if your partner is also alive and in like needs help, or like you could find them and bring them back to this sanctuary. Like I would have preferred if this was presented with that kind of nuance, but no, it's just presented as she's selfish and stupid, and Amani shakes her head at white woman shit, because as a black woman she has to do that. Also, as a black woman she has to be wearing a Black Lives Matter sweatshirt, and like that's no diss to the movement. Black Lives Matter is an incredibly important movement, motto, like ideology, but just the buildup of how Amani is written and how much of her boils down to, and here's a black woman, is upsetting. But yeah, so basically this chapter is just Gemma gets separated from her mom because her mom goes to look for her dad, who's probably dead. And that's about it. It's not a lot happens. We're now getting into the part of the book where, you know, I talked about how it was wine, women, and weed per PC Cass. That's how she described the book. We're now really getting into the part of the book where the weed comes in, because Hilary is now just widely prescribing weed for pain and anxiety, even though most of the injuries in the lodge, like the injured people in the lodge, are described as having like minor injuries and low-grade pain. And also there's been concern about like smoke and ash inhalation. So like, why are you having people smoke weed if you're concerned about smoke and ash inhalation? That doesn't seem like a good idea. There also was apparently just conveniently a weed growing up in the basement of the lodge. Like, I think it was employees of the lodge were growing weed there, which I'm not sure how that worked, but okay. We're really getting into the part of the story where they make decisions based on Stella's feelings. Like, they decide to leave the lodge, which is a very safe place as of this point. But they're like, we should leave and go into the unknown because Stella's instincts told us to. And that's like as far as their decision making goes, which is annoying as a reader because I want to see, like, I want to read about characters who have motivations and like goals in their actions. But as a writer, it's also really frustrating because I'm like, I understand what you are doing as a writer. You're going, I have a vision of where this story is going and I need a way to make the characters do that. And now there is a way that could have been done, perhaps instead of Stella's, because most of the characters end up having some sort of like magic power that they develop from being changed by the mist. And Stella's is heightened intuition and like essentially she's psychic. And there's a world in which that could have worked if she was given some kind of premonition outside of just feelings. Like if she was like, I'm trying to think of an example that doesn't sound too hokey, but like they end up going to the Painted Hills. And if she was like, I know I had a vision and I saw the Painted Hills and I don't know why, but this feels really important. I feel like we need to go to the Painted Hills. There's something waiting for us there. That still would have been a little bit like, okay, we're kind of going off of feelings, but at least there would have been a catalyst for that. And there would have been a reason for the characters to feel like that was a path to follow. As is, they're just going. So like, it's just like it's a frustrating choice from a craft perspective. As they're getting ready to leave, there's this teenage boy who works at the lodge. His name is Tyler, and he's very kind of besotted with Stella. Stella, please note, is like 45. She's like in her mid-40s, and this teenager is 18. And also Stella, it must be noted, is a high school teacher, so she presumably has students who are around, 17, 18. But Stella, when they're getting ready to leave, is reflecting on how doting Tyler is on her and is like, oh, it's a shame he's too young. And Mercury, PC Cast self-insert, Mercury herself being a high school teacher and PC Cast being a retired high school teacher, says, well, it's the apocalypse. No. You can't, why is PC Cast's self-insert endorsing that a 45-year-old woman sleep with an 18-year-old, sleep with a boy who is the same age as some of her students? Why is that even in a joke being presented as a fine and normal thing to do? Also of note is that right before they leave the lodge, they have Hillary check her blood, and Hillary's blood also can grow plants. So they're like, great, there's someone here who can use their blood to grow food, so we're not assholes for leaving with our own magic blood. They don't leave just yet, because the next chapter, we meet Sim, who is a trucker on the road to reunite with his husband and their 5 kids. Sim basically shows up to exposit some information because as a trucker he has a radio, and so he received a whole bunch of like information from other truckers about what was going on, and he has a better idea of like where all has been affected by the bombing. This is basically where it is like officially confirmed. It was already like highly suspected and much discussed that the bombings largely targeted every capital and anywhere with a major military base or large airport in the United States. There's some conversation about like what the response to this was, which is that there was a counterstrike of ICBMs, which is intercontinental ballistic missiles, I think is what that stands for. And Sim is basically like, oh, that means that whoever attacked us is like not going to attack us again because we blew them up. But it's kind of like, okay, but like, I mean, maybe, but you don't know if those strikes were countered themselves, or if they hit the right target, or if there were multiple nations involved in the attacks, or if the nation that initially started the attack has allies that are then going to retaliate against the states. Like, we don't really know, because like there is no communication outside of the states right now. They have no way of getting information from the outside world. But for the sake of dismissing future, concerns of being bombed, we're saying that it's fine now. So sure, I guess. This is the first moment that we kind of get a justification for why Stella was getting a feeling that they should leave, and it would have been better if they just got this information and then Stella was like, ooh, that feels bad, we need to go. The information being that Sim says a storm is rolling in, which means there's a snowstorm coming. And if it starts snowing, they're going to get trapped. And so, like, it would have been totally reasonable for them to learn that information and Stella be like, ooh, I got a really strong feeling about that. It could have been a moment of them being wishy-washy about, like, should we stay and get snowed in? Or, like, should we try and go somewhere else? Like, do we want to stay here? And then that be a moment that Stella goes, no, we got to go. That would have been fine with me. I think that would have been, like, a reasonable way to present it. But as is, it's just... she already got the feeling and they're already planning to leave. So, oh, good thing we were planning to leave. A storm's coming. It's also worth noting, I don't remember exactly where in this chapter it happens, but pretty early into Sim being introduced and mentioning his husband and kids, Stella, in, I think, kind of an aside with Mercury, is like, yeah, they're all dead. Where they are got wiped out. And she just knows this because of her psychicness. But this is yet again another instance of here's a gay character and here's a tragedy, like immediately connected together. That also means that these are the last gay characters we meet in this book. And so that means we technically meet 4 queer characters, and 2 of them are dead from the moment they're introduced. And them being dead queer characters is essentially what is used to establish that the surviving queer characters are queer. So the queer rep is not great. It gets worse in the next chapter, where pretty much the only thing that happens is Sim is heading back to his truck. He trips and falls down. He lands in an area where the mist has gathered. He dies. So rather than him just getting to leave the book and like maybe like we don't know what happens to him, but we can have our own supposition and whatever, he dies. He exits the book by dying, and the only reason he dies is so that the characters can take his truck radio, which I feel like there was a better way for them to get a truck radio than to kill off one of the only on-page queer characters, and having our 3rd overall queer death in the story, leaving Hillary as the only queer character to survive. So the next chapter is just a lot of talking. Of course, in my notes, it doesn't look like anything actually happens in this chapter. They're really concerned about growing food, and they're really, really emphasizing the magic blood being the thing they need to grow food, even though, like, people have grown food for millennia without magic blood or industrial methods of growing things. So, like, I don't know why we can't I don't know why magic blood is a necessity to grow food. Certainly in the short term, it's very helpful, but in the long term, like you don't need You don't need magic blood to grow food. You can just grow things. You could also, I mean, I guess they don't really have the means of learning how to forage, but eventually you can forage when you get a... Anyway, that's a whole tangent. There's more talk about the mist being fortuitous because misogyny and killing men is good.
So do you think whoever engineered this particular biological agent made it to wipe out men? Janet sounded equal parts pissed and skeptical. We can't know for sure if it was created to be that specific or if it's just a fortuitous byproduct. Heads turned as Stella joined them in the foyer. Fortuitous, said one of the other 3 men as he carefully sat up. His arm was in a sling and his thigh and head were heavily bandaged. His age was hard to determine as the gauze wrapped around his forehead also covered the side of his face, but Mercury guessed he was somewhere between 40 and 50. Well, let's see. Stella tapped her chin with exaggerated contemplation. Who's been in charge of the world until now? Men, said Gemma. Exactly. Stella put her fists on her waist and faced the wounded man. Women saved you. Women bandaged you. We'll continue to be sure you heal. Remember that. Is that a threat? Asked the man. What's your name? Stella countered with. Keith Carter. Well, Keith, we're not like that, said Stella. We're simply speaking to you honestly. This new world is going to be different. We're not going to tolerate misogyny. That's not a threat, it's the truth. Exactly. We're being truthful and making it clear more things have changed than our blood, Mercury said. Guess it's good you're leaving, muttered Keith. No, Keith, Hillary spoke firmly. We'll have none of that. Mercury and Stella are correct. Our blood has changed, and so has our world. We're not going to bicker with you, and we're not going to be bullied by you either. We will be compassionate, we will be truthful, we will be fair, and we will work together to survive this. If that is not how you want to live, you are free to go. I can't leave. I can barely walk.
And that's kind of it. That's kind of all that happens in this chapter. Are you sensing a pattern in how this book is constructed? Apologies if the angle has changed slightly. I had to clear some space off my phone. So they haven't left yet. They still haven't actually left yet. I think it's been like 3 or 4 chapters of them talking about leaving, but they haven't actually left the lodge yet. There's, more just talking about things like one of the first rules in their new world system that they discuss hypothetically is to lower the drinking age, which is a strange priority to have as one of the first things you will do, but okay. They talk about how Sadie, Gemma's mom, will find out that her husband is dead and will kill herself. And then they call this giving up.
I completely glossed over that comment because I got distracted by making a note to editing Rachel, that I needed to put trigger warnings at the beginning of the video, which, yes, indeed, necessary. Yeah, that's... Presenting someone being faced with a staggering level of tragedy and horror and life upending change, like everything she knows that Gemma's mom knows has been destroyed. Not just on the level of like her husband is dead, but like everything has been bombed into oblivion. There's dead people everywhere. There's people literally collapsing into goo from this biological weapon. There's still this green mist everywhere that can kill you. Like, her to hit a breaking point when she realizes the man she loves is dead, to hit that breaking point and end her own life, is not giving up, because that frames that as like, it almost frames it as pathetic. And I think that's just a really fucked up thing to do, especially because we're not supposed to like Sadie. So we are supposed to regard this as a like, almost like as a serves you right for leaving Gemma, even though Gemma is like fine with it. Like, she's barely affected by her mom leaving. So I don't know. I just think the framing of this was really, really fucked up and shitty. And it's made shittier by the fact that like PC Cast's representation of suicide in her work is generally like this. So I just wanted to make sure that I actually talked about that.
They do eventually conclude that being able to magically grow food doesn't mean they'll actually be able to garden. And so Jenny, who was the younger teacher, she hasn't come up much because she was kind of a nothing character. She's staying behind because she has a master's in botany, so she knows how to grow stuff. Stella declares that Mercury is the leader because her feelings told her so. In actuality, it's because Mercury is 1, the narrator, and 2, PC Cast self-insert. So she has to be the leader. We can't have a protagonist who isn't the leader of the group. There's more shitting on Karen because Karen references her religion, and that is rude, I guess. We're also told that Karen has told Mercury that she'll go to hell for being pagan, but we never see this. So again, we're told things, but we're not shown them. Oh, I completely forgot about this. So I think I'm seeing Madras being brought up now. So I think one of the things Sim passed on to them was that there was a sanctuary city called Madras where a lot of survivors have gone, so that's where they're heading to. Again, it doesn't make sense that they decided they were going to leave because of Stella's feelings, and then Sim shows up and gives them a reason to leave. Like, why couldn't we just have them be actually motivated to do something instead of it being completely random? A craft perspective, it was a strange choice to make, and I think this needed some developmental edits. Randomly, it's brought up that Mercury is a writer and she's good enough to publish. Of course she is. It's PC Cast. We're also told that Mercury and Jenny, like, they're having this tearful goodbye and they're supposed to be as close as sisters, but like, Jenny was kind of barely there. Like, I can't remember anything about Jenny except that she was a young teacher. That's all I remember about her. There was no real bond established between them, so this moment fell incredibly flat and was just kind of confusing. They have a limited amount of space to pack things. That's emphasized. They just have this truck. But of course, they fill the bed of truck, like they surround, I think they say that like the full perimeter of the truck bed is lined with wine bottles, because of course they have to bring as much wine as they possibly can, because it's it's survival gear. They need wine. The next chapter, we're now on to chapter 20. In my notes, this is like, I'm on page 16 of 29 in my notes. So we're 20 chapters, over almost 160 pages into the book, and all that has happened is we met the characters, the inciting incident happened with all the bombs, they fled from the collapsing cliff and all that, and they made it back to the lodge, and then they've just been at the lodge for like 100 pages just kind of talking and learning information and not really doing anything. Do you see how this book maybe has a pacing issue? And is it like it needed to be edited down a bit? They are driving for a bit. At some point, they stop to attach snow chains to their tires, which is explained at length in dialogue, because that was very necessary. And especially in this super fast-paced book, we really needed to slow down and describe how to attach tire chains. But while this is happening, a random man shows up and he has a gun, and he is sexist and racist because of course he is. Imani serves her purpose in this book by being a black woman, which allows her to be a signal of when you shouldn't trust someone based on how they treat a black woman. There's this whole confrontation with this man. Mercury is getting ready to shoot him. Bearing in mind, this is the second time that Mercury having a firearm and being really good with firearms has been super emphasized during a confrontation where she intends to shoot someone, and then she doesn't. In this instance, it's because Gemma comes out of nowhere with a tire iron and busts his knee. Okay. They steal his rifle. That's basically the point of this scene, is they get another gun. We still have not seen Mercury fire a gun. This is going to be a point of contention for me as we go forward in the book. If you want to establish that a character is really proficient in firearms and that is like an important skill they have, they should at some point shoot a gun, preferably before it is a high stakes situation in which we need to know that they are good with the fire. Like, it should be actually established in action, not just dialogue and narration. There is more travel, there's more inane dialogue about just random stuff, and also incredibly poorly constructed dialogue. Let me read you a sentence. Did I tell you why I changed my major from a pre-veterinary focus to secondary education? Like, that's just not how friends talk to each other. That's not normal dialogue. On their trip, they end up stopping. I think Stella gets a feeling that they need to stop or something. They stop in this little town and they find 3 kids whose parents died, and they basically like adopt these kids, which sure, I don't hate that, but I don't like the way the kids are written, and ultimately these kids don't really matter. They are there for Imani because Imani's whole character is that she is black and she is a mother. That's all she does, is mother and to be black. So these kids are here so that Imani can be a mother, which notably means she can be excluded from scenes in the future because she has to stay behind to mother.
Editing Rachel back again because I also need to talk about just the optics of this. You're one black woman in your group of, at this point, all white women. She is the one who stays behind to look after all of the white children, someone else's white children. She stays behind and looks after them. There are cultural and historical precedences for why that is an uncomfortable way to treat your black character. And there's no reason for it. It's just someone needs to stay behind, and Imani is the mother character, so she stays behind. Anyway, yeah, I needed to highlight that aspect of it as well, because I think that is a choice.
So they end up, like, while they're at the, like, they went to these kids' house, I think, and while they're at the kids' house, they gather up some supplies, which, sure, leave again, but they run into Al again. I should note that when they met Al, his nose was bleeding, and his nose is still bleeding, which is interesting. It's supposed to show that he's been affected by the mist, but not enough to die, but, like, he is slowly deteriorating. This scene confirms that Al is involved with the same group as the man who, like, they earlier took the rifle from. This is the first time we see Mercury use a firearm. She's on the back of a truck, steadying I think it's the rifle, and she's steadying it against the, like, tailgate of the truck, and there's snowmobiles, like, right up against the truck. Like, she can see the whites of the eyes of the snowmobile driver. I wrote down the order of what happened, so I'm gonna actually read it out. She has no idea where the first bullet went, but the second one hit the engine block. The third was dodged by the second snowmobile, but that dodging it caused him to crash. So I'm still unclear on whether or not I should actually consider Mercury a good shot, because she technically missed twice. I mean, I guess the second shot was dodged, but, like, it was super, super close up. She was in a moving vehicle, though, but it was steadied against the back of the truck. I don't know. The next chapter, the characters talk for a bit. There is a very long scene of reading a map. Literally, like, it's not the narration describing the map. It is characters in dialogue looking at the map and discussing what they see and where they will go. I cannot emphasize enough how plodding and fluffed out and boring this book is. The Green Mist shows up, and they talk for, like, almost an entire page about, oh, we really need to leave because the mist is here. But they're just talking instead of leaving. I have another brilliant sentence that I wrote down. The rain pattered the roof with the comforting familiarity of rain on a roof. It's fucking incredible writing. This book was definitely well edited. We have some effort made to address how Al is still alive after 3 days, like 3 days after being exposed to the mist. And the answer is fat shaming and ableism. The men who died quickly either had some kind of health condition or were fat. And Al is fit, so he doesn't die. So if you're keeping track, the mist is gendercidal, ableist, and fatphobic. Gotcha. I also, in my notes, I go into some detail about, like, how this logic doesn't super make sense. So they say that the length of exposure or the intensity of exposure also affects how long or well men survive after being in the mist, but that's, like, not super consistent. The coach and principal were both outside right next to the women when the mist went over them. They had no protection. Davis was completely liquefied when the women woke up from unconsciousness, but Hale didn't liquefy until like someone touched him. But Davis was a coach and a volunteer firefighter, so, like, presumably he would have been in better shape than Hale, Hale being the principal. And I assume, like, I'm pretty sure Hale was mentioned to have, like, blood pressure issues. So, like, shouldn't he have been the one to die faster. There were two men when they found the group of survivors on the road on the way to the lodge. Todd and Jason were exposed to the same amount of mist, but one survived hours longer than the other. Sim was in the mist for like seconds and he died. Even though it was the only time he had been exposed. He was described as fat, but so was another character named Bob, and Bob survived for hours after being exposed. And like, why would it kill the baby in womb that died when he was in utero? And so he wouldn't have directly inhaled the mist. It would have been filtered through his mother, who can survive the mist. So like, why did he instantly liquefy? The more you unpack it, the less sense it makes. Anyway, they continue traveling. They end up needing to go pee. And they spend 3 pages, I kid you not, 3 pages just talking about the logistics of going to pee in the woods and making sure they don't get caught in the mist. 3 pages about pee. In this scene, one of the kids like falls or something, and they have to, like, the next chapter they're trying to rescue the kids, but it's just like, it's so slow because of how bloated the prose is. Anyway, the point of the scene is that Gemma and Mercury are re-exposed to the mist. This is when Ford is introduced. He helps save Georgie. Also fell in the mist, Georgie being the little girl. There's a little girl and 2 twin boys, but Ford helped save them. There's some talk about how Mercury seems to have heightened like strength and speed, but Mercury's super dismissive of this, even though it's Stella, her psychic friend, saying it, and they've already decided to trust that Stella is psychic. So I don't know why Mercury would be dismissive of this. Like, it doesn't super make sense. Next chapter, we're being more properly introduced to Ford. There's a lengthy description of him because he is a man of color. He is Latino. So we get, exotifying descriptions of his skin. He throws in random Spanish into his dialogue.
Mercury had zero clue which twin it was, but with a 50-50 shot at getting it right, she called, "Caden." The boy looked up from staring at the green fog. He blinked several times, but finally focused on her. "Do not move. When I get there, I'm going to turn my back to you. Climb on my shoulders. You'll be fine up there. The fog can't get you." Mercury desperately hoped she was right about that. "Do you understand?" The little boy nodded shakily. Fear roiled in Mercury's stomach. The fog was only inches from her. It hugged the rocky riverbank in swirly eddies that lifted about to her thighs, maybe her waist. She looked at the boy again. His eyes were trapped on her. Tears leaked from them, and he had wrapped his arms around his narrow chest like he was trying to hold himself together. Mercury closed her mind to the memory of Amelia, Mr. Hale, and Coach Davis. Todd and Jason. Bob and Sim bleeding out because that green crap had taken them. "I believe I'm going to be okay. I'm not going to breathe it in. I'll grab the kid and get us out of there." Mercury sprinted forward, slipping and sliding on rain-slick rocks. The swirling fog parted, as if welcoming her, and then it lapped around her legs and waist. Mercury ignored it. She kept her gaze locked on the boy. She reached the boulder, turned her back to Caden, and crouched just low enough for him to climb awkwardly onto her shoulders. "Hang on." Mercury couldn't sprint back. The fog now blanketed the entire riverside, completely obscuring the rocky ground. She was too afraid she'd slip and the boy would fall from her shoulders. She had to walk slowly, carefully instead. Her gaze darted to the river, where the man had reached Georgie and was talking to her. Georgie had stopped sobbing and nodded as she clung monkey-like to his back. Mercury looked from the river to the steep bank where Amani, Stella, and Karen urged them on, waiting to lift up the other twin and Gemma. She hadn't been able to get the boy up to her shoulders, so Gemma carried him half in her arms, half over one shoulder, to keep him above the fog that billowed around her waist. Like Mercury, she couldn't move quickly, but had to pick her way blindly over the slick, wet rocks. This goes on for several more pages. And yeah, we basically just spend the entire chapter learning who this guy is. Next chapter, somewhere along the way, Mercury, they're like crossing a bridge, I think, and the bridge starts collapsing, and Mercury describes in just way too many words how she pulls herself up back onto the bridge when it collapses. And there's a huge deal made about the fact that she was able to do a straight arm pull up or something, and that she will take as proof that she now has magic strength. And I'm like, fucking okay. The board's splinters sliced into her fingers and cut the palms of her hands, but Mercury didn't let go. The backpack pulled her down, but she gritted her teeth. and instead of allowing the current to take her and pull her to the bottom, Mercury grunted and concentrated. Then she attempted something she'd been trying to accomplish in the gym for years. Using an overhand grip on the rough plank, she pulled herself up until her chin was above the board, and then methodically, Mercury straightened her arms, heaving up until her chest had cleared the board and her waist was even with it. She swung her legs to the side, up and over, and with abs of steel she had zero clue she owned, Mercury powered up the rest of the way onto the bridge, landing in a crouching position.
Oh, actually, no, sorry. On reviewing my notes, she is still in denial that she has super strength. She is engaged in multiple acts of incredible strength, and she's still like, no, I don't think anything magical happened to me. Girl. The next chapter is another nothing chapter. It's some more travel. It's recapping. They encounter a dead goat randomly. Mercury prays over the dead goat, like she says a pagan prayer over the dead goat. And this is super random because they have not mourned or prayed over a single dead body that they have found or encountered on this journey, including the bodies of their coworkers and friends. But Mercury stops to pray over a dead goat. This is important because of Karen's powers and how they are established. The next chapter, more travel. There's just way too much time spent on characters giving directions. They arrive relatively to where they are going, I think. There's some discussion about who will remain in the truck and what they will do while the others are away. We learn that Gemma can literally heal. That's about all that happens in this chapter. I need to speed up how I'm going through this because this is already over an hour long and I have 7 pages of notes left to get through. So let's try and speed up. When they get to Madras, there's like a checkpoint before you enter because it's a sanctuary town and they want to make sure marauders don't come in, which seems fine to me as a reader because I'm like, you guys have like Mercury and friends have already been attacked on the road 3 times by people who are trying to like steal their supplies or kidnap women for breeding stock. That's what the man with the rifle was trying to do, and that's what Al was trying to do the second time he encountered them. So yeah, that's actually pretty fair for them to have a checkpoint and like be wary of who they're letting into their town and make sure it is in fact actually a sanctuary town. If you promise a safe haven, you have to keep it safe. But it's supposed to be, oh, that's sketchy. Anyway, they meet this woman named Amber. She's at the checkpoint. Mercury immediately accuses Amber of being a misogynist because Amber makes a comment about Ford being strong and, tall and capable, and he must be taking good care of these ladies with him. But their story that they tell when they get to the checkpoint is that Ford was their guide on like a expedition and he's been taking care of them. So Mercury is mad at Amber and accusing her of being a misogynist for believing their story, which just doesn't make any sense. Like, even if she thinks it's misogynistic, why is she upset about it? Because like they were counting on that. A random black woman shows up and is angry, and basically she's claiming that they like won't let her leave. And Amber dismisses this woman as mentally ill, and no one is concerned about the ableism of insisting, well, that person's mentally ill, so don't listen to them. Like, nobody bats an eye at that. They just go, I don't think that's true. I don't think she's mentally ill, which is like, sure, fine, but also it's fucked up to claim you should ignore the words of someone who's mentally ill. Like, I don't know. The evil town is Christian. We're supposed to hate Amber because she flirts with Ford. End of chapter. We arrive at Madras. Amber is introduced, and clearly she's evil because she likes Ford. Okay. Also, she's Christian, so Christian people are evil. I say this as for point of reference. I am not religious at all, so when I'm being defensive of Christian people in this book, it is purely because the way PC Cast conveys Christianity as evil is like it's just not done right. There is certainly a way to write a Christian villain who uses Christianity for villainous purposes. A book I read last year, Say a Little Prayer by Jenna Voris, does a very good job, but it also works because we see Christianity in a range of perspectives and like faiths, like not faiths, but a range of how people practice their faith. So, it works better. There's nuance. In this, it's just Christian people are evil and not a whole lot of thought beyond that. The next chapter is basically, I think they've gotten to the room they're staying in and they drink some wine, and Stella is already trying to push Ford and Mercury together. They've known him for less than a day. End of chapter. That's all that happens in chapter 31. Chapter 32, they wake up, like they've spent the night in the sanctuary town. They're planning to steal supplies from this town. Notably, the other characters they've encountered who have been vilified and presented as evil, a big part of the reason why they were vilified is because they were trying to steal supplies from Mercury and her friends. But when Mercury and her friends steal supplies from a sanctuary town, notably during an apocalypse when supplies are very much finite, they have no idea when they are going to be able to find or reproduce some of these items like menstrual products. That's fine though, that's just them being survivalists, and they're the heroes, so we don't question it. There's more Mercury slut shames in her narration, slut shames other women for flirting with Ford. Notably, this is a situation where most men have died, and an attractive, tall, capable, kind man has just shown up in town, but all the women flirting with him are like mosquitoes, even though Mercury herself has been flirting with Ford. It's just so hypocritical and just incredibly shitty to other women, which is a running theme you may have noticed in this text. I will say there is there's two good moments in this book. There's this moment here where Stella is talking to Mercury about, oh, don't worry about those women flirting with Ford. He's only interested in, and then her dialogue cuts off because Ford interrupts saying, Mercury, he's completing Stella's statement. I liked that. I thought that was cute. You did a good one. 1 point. I don't know how many negative points we're at this point, but you did get one positive. We also learn that I believe the mayor of Madras, Mayor Cruz, is having people, when they menstruate, she's having them use menstrual cups so that they can reserve the blood, and then that blood can be used to grow food. And this is presented as kind of sinister and evil, but it's actually kind of brilliant because this is waste blood. It's blood that's going to come out of their bodies regardless. So it, one, resolves the issue, at least to a degree, of limited menstrual products, because if more people are using menstrual cups, those are reusable and not that hard to sterilize. You just need to boil them in water generally. So it's something that can be sterilized and reused, and it helps them grow food. And it's it would have been waste otherwise. So it's I don't really see a problem with that, but it's presented as very sinister and evil. The next chapter, they're getting ready for some kind of festival or party or whatever. We spend many pages of them changing their outfits and talking about their outfits and just not important things. It's 3 pages. Mercury, when they get to the party, complains about how white the town is, which is weird because it's it's almost it's presenting it as if this was orchestrated that the town is white, but we have no way of knowing if that's the case. And this may have just been it's a small town in the middle of nowhere in Oregon. It may have just been a really white town. But also it rings weird because it's Mercury, you are white, and the group you came with is almost entirely white. It's her, Stella, Karen, and Ford. So 3/4 of their group is white, but Mercury is criticizing the lack of diversity in this town. But it's you're kind of contributing to that though. It's just weird. Moira, the angry black woman, shows up again and continues to be an angry black woman. Again, she is accused of being mentally ill, and again, no one is concerned about this ableism. They just say it's a lie. End of chapter. We get to the next chapter. This is continuing in the same festival. There's this whole big deal made about Mercury and Ford are talking, and there's this whole big deal made about how oh my god, Ford is a man who reads for pleasure, and then several pages of talking about what authors he reads, and it's just PC Cast kind of praising herself.
You read for pleasure? He laughed. Absolutely. Why do you look so shocked? Mercury opened her mouth, thought better of what she was about to say, closed it, and reconsidered her response. As Ford held her close, she finally said, "I've been trying to figure out how to answer that without sounding like a man-hater, and I'm not being very successful." Ford grinned. "It's not man-hating to tell me you haven't met a lot of grown-up men who read for pleasure. I don't know many besides the men in my family either." "Well, good. Then that's my answer. What kind of books do you like?" "I read across genres. The truth is that I hate genre labels. I think they keep people from reading." "Oh my goddess, I've been saying that for years. Like, even though there are some awesome romance books that I know my male students would love, because they're labeled romance, it's almost impossible to get guys to give them a try." Ford nodded. "Exactly. I really enjoy science fiction and fantasy, especially sci-fi fantasy written by women." He grinned at her shocked expression. "Women tend to add more complex character development and, get this, sex to the genre. I enjoy both." So the not liking genre labels thing, that's a PC Cast thing that PC Cast says a lot. And the whole thing about women being better at writing sci-fi fantasy, that's PC Cast bragging about herself. And later in the scene, he talks about how his favorite series is The Dragon Riders of Pern, which is PC Cast's favorite series, or like one of her favorite series growing up. So it's just PC Cast bragging about herself, essentially.
Ford is also likable because he's not religious and dislikes the Christian God, because as we all know, Christianity is evil and people who are Christian are bad people, per the logic of this book. Mercury talks about her faith and her paganism, and how, I think this was like, was it Beltane? She's all upset because like she had this ritual she was going to do with her friends, but obviously that can't happen because like probably all those friends are dead, and also she's nowhere near where they would be if they were alive. And she describes the ritual she would have done, and then Ford offers to do a ritual with her, and then she describes the mini ritual they're going to do, and then they actually do the ritual and it's described in text. And somehow Ford knows what to say within the ritual, even though he's never performed a pagan ritual before. So it's a very repetitive scene, and like it could be a really good scene. It could have been a very, like, I understand what it's trying to do, and I think it could have been a very sweet moment between Mercury and Ford. But ultimately, it's just like, it's the same problem throughout the text where everything just feels very bloated and stiff. These characters don't sound like people, and I don't really feel like they're actually bonding so much as just words are passing between them. And I just wish, like, I like the idea of this scene, but it ultimately doesn't come to anything. And I think part of it is because Ford, from my recollection, doesn't really get to inject any of his own beliefs or experiences or personality into the ritual. He's just doing what Mercury wants him to do. And I understand how that appeals from a wish fulfillment perspective, but as both a reader and a writer, I would rather see how Ford as himself fits into this ritual, and that almost be kind of a metaphor of how he could fold into Mercury's life and how they would like fit together while still being distinct people, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's that chapter. The next chapter, it's like Mercury can't sleep or something because she sneaks out, and there's like this padlock on one of the doors that like leads to a stairway to the roof, and Mercury breaks the padlock so that she can go up to the roof, but like she has no real reason to do it, she just does. But there is an in-text reason why she would want to do that, because they're staying in a school. I don't know if I explained that. The school has been converted into an emergency shelter, which makes sense. Like, that's totally fair. The classrooms can serve as rooms for different people. And one of the courtyards is locked off, and like the windows are blacked out. And the characters are kind of suspicious of this, but it's dismissed as like, oh, like that's where we're keeping the dead bodies that like we're trying to, you know, sort through and figure out who they are and give them burials and stuff. So like we just don't want people to see into there. And that's like, sure, that's fine. I don't like, that's a perfectly fair reason to give. But like the characters are still a little bit suspicious about it. And so it would have been more sensible if Mercury was like, while I'm up and about, maybe I should see if I can get onto the roof and look into that courtyard. So Mercury shatters a padlock on the door. Somehow no one hears this, even though like that had to have been really loud. We have a scene with Karen too. I don't know if Karen followed Mercury. I don't remember exactly what happened, but her and Mercury have a conversation. And this is the first moment where we kind of sort of have a little bit of Karen coming across as being prejudiced towards Mercury and her faith. But the reason for that is because Karen's magic abilities have manifested and she can see spirits and stuff. So when earlier I mentioned Mercury praying over a dead goat, when Mercury did that, Karen saw a portal open and the spirit of the goat go through the portal. And so Karen thought that Mercury performed some kind of satanic ritual, which sure, yeah, if that's the first time you ever see that kind of spiritual, magical thing happen, and you have been raised in a certain faith, not an unreasonable or offensive conclusion to come to. She doesn't know what's going on, but Karen and Mercury have a conversation about this. Mercury explains what she was actually doing. Karen realizes that she has magic and they're fine. So again, Karen comes across as an extremely reasonable person, especially given the amount of vitriol everyone's directing at her. And so all the efforts to vilify her and make her out to be this terrible, awful person just don't work. And it just makes me hate all the other characters interacting with her. Anyway, they go up to the roof. They see Amber and two of her goons roughing up Moira. And that's the end of the chapter. The next chapter, we continue with the scene of them roughing up Moira. We learn that the mayor has been withholding information from people about their blood-making plants grow, because Moira doesn't know that the reason she wasn't allowed to leave the town is because she has this magic blood. But that doesn't make sense narratively, because it's okay, imagine you are the mayor of this town in the aftermath of this apocalyptic event, and you learn that some people have blood that can grow plants. You know that these people, this is all, quote unquote biological women who can do this, people who will menstruate. So you go, if blood can grow plants and the people who have blood that can grow plants will menstruate, then I should just announce this, give some sort of discussion of this, and ask that they provide their menstrual blood so that we can grow food, so that we can survive. And given that this is specifically a Christian town, she could even frame it as a blessing from God to help them survive this calamity, and that these women who do have this magic blood, if they pass this test and their blood can make plants grow, then they are the chosen of God. They are God's favorite, and they are the ones who will help the town find salvation after this tragedy. And it would be so easy. It could still be sketchy and manipulative and culty, but it would be so easy to make this work. And now as I'm thinking about it more, the culty angle could have been, instead of it just being this one or two figures, because it's the mayor and Amber, instead of it just being these two women who are they're doing sketchy stuff in the shadows and they're lying to their constituents or whatever, it could have been that they turned this town into a cult in the aftermath of all this panic and tragedy and terror, and used that cult to control the people, not only a lot of it to be getting women to donate their menstrual blood, but also in the sense of being then controlling of people who try to enter the sanctuary, and it not just being Amber and the Mayor Cruz, stopping people from leaving and doing this in the shadows and doing this secretively, but this being a mass thing that the people in town do, and possibly even having it on a more sinister level of there being some kind of stratification or dichotomy based on who has magic blood and who doesn't, and the way that people in the town are treated and the way resources are distributed and allocated. That could have been a really, really interesting and horrifying thing to explore, but instead it's done in this really shallow way where there's no real engagement in the idea of this is an evil Christian town. It's evil because it's Christian. It's not because of anything they're actually doing with that. Basically, it's a missed opportunity. It could have been really interesting. Anyway, Moira gets killed. We only have 3 on-page people of color. One of them has died, and she was the most token of the token black characters. Well, they're not all black. Token people of color. There's also a random bit I just want to acknowledge where Amber refers to white men as a species. And normally I'd be oh, well, it's a villain saying that, so we're probably not supposed to agree with her. But that's how Stella and Mercury talk about men, especially white men. So it's I don't know if I'm supposed to disagree with her, actually. Unclear.
As my mother often said, it takes a very good man to be better than no man at all, and neither you, Wes, nor you, Mitch, are good men. One of the many wondrous things this apocalypse has done is to finally put the entitled white man on the endangered and soon-to-be extinct species list.
Anyway, Mercury and Karen leave. They tell their group, like, hey, shit's fucked, we need to leave. And they try to escape, but they get caught. And there's this action scene where, like, Mercury's using her super speed and her super strength, but she sounds like a cartoon character because it describes her running circles around the car that Amber and her goons are in chasing them. Mercury finally uses the pistol, and it just kind of, like, it doesn't land because we've never seen her use the pistol before. I feel like it would have been more satisfying, again, I'm thinking of this in the moment, it would have been more satisfying if when they found the firearm, it was established that, like, yes, I'm proficient in firearms, but, like, she's only ever, like, gone to a range and shot some targets. She's never really, like, been in an active situation where she needs to fire a gun, and she has a little bit of cold feet about the idea of, like, oh, I might have to hit, like, a moving target or, like, a person, and has some stress over that. And this could have been a moment of triumph where she not only overcomes that emotional block, but also really seizes her power, because one of her power is also improved marksmanship. Somehow super strength and super speed make her a better shot. But, like, that could have been there could have been a build up to it. But instead it's just like, oh, she said she was good at shooting and she finally did a thing where she shot something. Great. Anyway, Mercury does end up getting shot as well. I think she gets injured somehow, and they escape. The next chapter is Mercury being healed, but, like, somehow, even though she's on the brink of death, she still keeps describing things in, like, extremely vivid detail. And it's because PC Cast wants to describe the setting she's in, because, like, this is a really beautiful place and I want readers to know how beautiful it is. But, like, she's doing it in a scene where her narrator should be insensible because she has lost so much blood. So it just makes the actual stakes of the scene not work. Anyway, Mercury's healed. She's literally completely fine. There's nothing achieved by her getting shot, except we learn more about how Gemma's healing powers work. Then, who is it? Mercury, Stella, and Gemma dance naked in the rain. The chapter ends. Sure. This is just done so that there can be a scene where their blood grows wildflowers, which is a cool idea, and I like the imagery of it, but in context, it's just kind of like, all right. This is another nothing chapter. The only important note I have of this chapter is, all caps, 68 bottles of wine. That is how much wine they're carrying. In their very, very important survival supplies, they have 68 bottles of wine. Next chapter, they've arrived at the Painted Hills. They're talking about what they're going to do there. They end up going on a supply run to this little town nearby. It is completely decimated by the mist because it's in a valley. And so they go on this supply run, and the entire chapter is them talking about the supply run, driving to the supply run, doing the supply run, talking about what they plan to do with the supplies they get. I will note there is one, like, the other good moment in this book is they're in one of the little shops in this town, and there's, like, of course there's dead bodies in there. And there's a note about how they, like, take a couple flags off the wall. There's, like, a Confederate flag on the wall. And there's a note about, like, you know, that's the first good thing that flag has ever done or something like that. And I'm like, yeah, good. I agree. So those are the two, we've covered the two good moments in this entire book. There's no more good. Anyway, Stella has a feeling, but she can't tell if it's an actual psychic feeling or if it's just because they're in a town full of dead bodies and that feels bad. But she's saying they need to leave quickly and they need to be quiet. But they still stand at the truck and talk at length about what they're going to do with their supplies. And then they go on foot to get wine glasses, and then they find a dog. And then they rescue the dog, which, like, fine. But then they're like, oh, we need to get supplies for the dog now. Oh, Mist is moving in. Hey, Ford. It's Stella, Mercury, and Ford on this journey. Hey, Ford, can you go to the animal supply store and get us dog food? Why not send Mercury, who has super speed and super strength and won't die in the mist? Let's just send Ford to do it. Anyway, there's also a whole bunch of talk about how they need to be quiet, but Ford shows up, like, not only with dog food, but also with chickens. And both of them separately, upon when they see the chickens, Mercury goes, chickens! And Stella goes, chickens! And this is right after they establish that they need to be quiet. Al shows up, because of course he does, even though They're in Painted Hills, and his base of operations is like way the fuck away from here, but for some reason, he came down into this valley to this tiny, tiny little town to look for supplies. Completely out of his way. Like, it doesn't make any sense why he would come this way, especially given the risk of encountering more mist because they are in a valley. Anyway, Al is a cartoon villain, so he's, jaundiced and emaciated, and he's constantly bleeding from his nose. And we also learn that he's sexist and racist because Ford, as a person of color, has to serve his key purpose of being a barometer of how evil characters are by giving them an outlet for their racism. Al tries to attack them. Ford... This is a point of contention for me. This is the first time Ford and Al ever meet. Ford has absolutely no stakes in anything going on with Al. The only thing he would care about in this scene is Stella and Mercury. Stella and Mercury this is supposed to be a feminist apocalypse. Mercury has superpowers. She has super strength and super speed and super aim. It is not Stella and Mercury who save Ford. It is Ford who saves Stella and Mercury and gives them an opportunity to shoot Al as he drags Al into the mist. But Al has already shot Ford when this happens. So Ford dies. Ford, one of the only people of color on page in this book, dies protecting two white women from a white man he had never met before in a scene that has nothing to do with him. We will note that over the course of this book, Ford has had zero personal motives and personal goals. All he has done is serve the group of primarily white women he has been traveling with, and then he dies for them. Next chapter is Ford's funeral. We have a super lengthy statement spanning multiple paragraphs from Mercury as she performs a pagan ritual for Ford. She knows Ford is not pagan, but she performs a pagan ritual for him. Remember when Mercury complained at the idea of forcing your religion on other people at the beginning of this book? And now, in death, when Ford literally cannot advocate for himself, she's like, we're doing a pagan ritual. To the point that Karen does say a prayer, but it's a short prayer and it is not shown on page. It just says she prays. So the ceremony is almost entirely pagan. Mercury then literally dances on Ford's grave so that she can bleed on it and plant wildflowers, which, like, again, the imagery and the idea is okay, but it just feels weird. Like, the text does a really bad job of establishing, of like making things feel connected and meaningful. Imani then reveals what her powers are, which is prophecy ? She says some weird cryptic shit. And the black character's power is basically the same as another white character's power, except she is seemingly even less in control of it. The last chapter of the book, Ford materializes into Mercury's dream and he leaves behind a physical trace, I think a flower. Also, he has horns. The end. That's the book. I want to go back to the conversation about this mist as a... This video's so long, fuck it. The mist is a biological weapon and it kills men, right? That has been thoroughly established throughout the book based on like how many men have died and how many women have survived the mist. And especially the fact that the baby in utero died from the mist. So we know that there is some kind of biological marker causing the mist to kill men. Notably, the conversations about this aspect of the mist have involved Gemma, an aspiring doctor, Dr. Hillary, who is she's a naturopath. She does not have a medical degree. Mercury, who has some kind of science degree. I don't remember if it's specified. And Imani, who also has a science degree. But we have all these people with backgrounds in some degree of science or medicine, and none of them at any point, including the queer character, none of them at any point go, What biological marker, though? What is it about men that makes them die in the mist? None of them go, I wonder what would happen if a man had say, testicular cancer and had their testicles removed. Would they still die? Was that the biological marker? What about a woman who's post-menopause and, some women, when they go into menopause, they take testosterone. Would that hormone alteration cause them to die in the mist? What about, there's no discussion whatsoever about any of this. There's no conversation about, what about trans people? Do they have to be physically transitioned in some way to survive the mist? Would they die regardless? Is it chromosomal? There's no discussion at all about this as a biological weapon, which again, the author made the choice to introduce several characters who have some kind of background in medicine or science, and none of them are asking these questions. And this is especially notable because of how much emphasis is placed on the idea of men versus women. There's so many conversations about, well, men are like this and women are like this. So this is us, ultimately, this is a book that's very, very focused on gender. Gender is really important to the narrative and the theming of this book. So a discussion about what it means to be a man or a woman and what it means to the mist for someone to be a man or a woman would actually fit this story. It would lend weight to what this book is trying to say and do. But instead, we just completely ignore that facet in favor of just very, very flat buzzword feminism and, yay, kill all men, which again, that doesn't, just completely misunderstands how systems of oppression work. There's also, as I kind of touched on throughout the video, there's a number of other issues like the fat shaming, the religious intolerance towards Karen, and just generally assuming anyone who is Christian must be evil, the constant gay death and gay tragedy, people of color and how they are described, how tokenized they are, the fact that 2 out of 3 of them die, and then also in the background, Imani's whole family has died, so that's more Black characters dying in the background. There was, casual ableism throughout. It is a book that, for a book that's supposed to be a feminist apocalypse story, it really does not deliver on the feminism aspect. Again, it's just buzzword feminism. The characters say things that sound empowering and don't really have any thought behind what it actually means or how that functions. That kind of leads into another point I have about this book is I kept talking about how slow this book was and how much time the characters spent just talking about things and how much they emphasized having their weed and having their wine and what are they wearing and all this kinds of stuff. And the thing is there's a version of this book where that could have worked. I think the kind of book PC Cast should have written is a cozy apocalypse. And I know that sounds like a fucking bizarre subgenre, but I think there is room for that in the sense of okay, everything has gone to shit. So many people we care about have died, but we are still alive and we still have each other and we are going to rebuild. And the story could focus on that. And I think if PC Cast had leaned into that and really genuinely made it a book about wine, women, and weed, I think it would have been a way better story, because when she's trying to include these heavier, more serious topics like misogyny and generally misogyny, but also religious extremism and stuff like that, it ends up not working because she does it way too surface level and she doesn't delve into it enough, and there wasn't enough thought or just developmental edits done on the concept. I feel like it isn't hard to look at the narrative of Madras and think of a more cohesive and sinister way to actually present that situation, but that just wasn't done. And so it ends up making the book feel especially because we spend so much of this book just kind of doing nothing, when we then get to these more serious scenes and they're so poorly thought out and developed, it just ends up making the whole book feel effectively empty. Nothing in the book really matters because none of it mattered to the author. But if the book was all scenes of the characters traveling and getting to know each other and, you know, trying to find hope and trying to, like, it would have been really interesting. There's kind of this thing with Karen that goes on a little bit in this book, but it becomes more of a thing in the next book, where Karen talks about how she wanted to be a dancer, but because of her fundamentalist Christian upbringing, she wasn't allowed to be a dancer. And that's something she starts trying to reclaim in the aftermath, is dance and dancing. And I think it would have been really interesting if all of the characters had something like that. If Mercury had something she left behind. It was mentioned that she writes. Maybe that could have been a thing. Maybe in one of their supply runs, maybe, or even when they're at the lodge and they're at the boutique, maybe she finds a notebook and a pen and she's like, I'm going to start writing this down. And she, you know, reclaims her, you know, lost or kind of set aside identity as a writer and allows herself to have that. Especially like the idea of these characters maybe having things they wanted to do when they were younger, but they were told that that wasn't realistic, that wasn't a thing that they could really pursue, it wouldn't come to anything. And now in this context where it's like, well, nothing matters right now, I don't have a career, they can all pursue those things. Mercury could write, Karen can dance. Like, we could do things like that with all those characters and have them be exploring that and reclaiming themselves. And that could have been a really interesting through line and metaphor of, you know, yes, there has been destruction, but from that destruction we can have rebirth. And you still could have kept the fun magic and weirdness and stuff, and I think that would have been fine. But I also think moments like the characters dancing and their blood growing wildflowers would have hit better in a narrative about rebirth coming from destruction and pain. And it would have felt more thematically consistent, where in this book it's just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess their blood grows plants, so sure, that would happen. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot of potential in this concept, but it just wasn't really, it feels like the author wasn't actually quite sure what she wanted to do. It's like there's 3 books stapled together in here and none of them are fully fleshed out or well considered. It's unfortunate. I feel that way about a lot of PC Cast books, and that's why part of the reason why I keep reading them. Point is, this book does not do a good job of exploring feminism. It does not do a good job of showcasing apocalypse, and it does not do a good job of having a plot or any pacing whatsoever. It was a 1 star, and this video is incredibly wildly long, so I will end it here. I will try to edit it down into something coherent. I said I was going to do a less rambly video. It doesn't seem like that happened, but I'll stop now, and at some point I will pick up with Out of the Dawn, which is the second and final book in the duology.